when I was majoring in history at a college in California as a foreign student almost 20 years ago. I was told more than once to simply read as many books and newspapers as possible in order to improve my writing skills. I dream of being a nonfiction writer. I desire to achieve the most heartfelt and forthright verbal and written expressions. I look up to George Orwell. I think Cheryl Strayed is amazing. Their written expressions not only evoke deep emotions and vivid imagery, but also bring compelling logic and rationality in the matter of a second. I began to live in the United States when I turned 18. People often told me that I must have an uncanny knack for learning English. I also firmly believed that I would be able to master English in no time. You may think that I don't seem to have much of an accent. I may sound pretty good for an English as a second language learner from Korea, just because I know how to properly utter combinations of English words. I have lived in the US longer than I lived in my native country. After spending 30 years learning English, I was willing to do anything in order to escape my sense of perpetual discontent and inadequacy. Justifications and excuses only deepened my dissatisfaction. I often find myself unable to eloquently express my thoughts and emotions in English. I'm not trying to be native-like. I only wish to go about my daily activities without feeling linguistically compromised. Upon the completion of a decade-long work project in the summer 2019, I set a goal to be on TED. I wanted to publicly talk or write about my unique experiences and honest observations both as an ESL learner and as a professional, by taking into account 2 generations of empirical study and fieldwork on diverse Asian learners. I felt that it was necessary for me to brush up on my own writing and overall English speaking skills. What I hadn't expected was that I was in for a rude awakening after spending 30 years of my life on learning English. This is what I learned after spending the most grueling 6 months poring over the entire 2 different dictionaries, a phrasal verb and an American idioms dictionary. Despite the 2 decades of having lived in the US, in all frankness, it turns out that I had only scraped by with the limited English expressions accumulated from surface imitation. I fully recognize that it's not at all as simple as stringing easy words together and producing such expressions spontaneously. If you think I'm being unreasonably humble about my English, I'll give you a brief example for the reason why I feel frustrated as a learner with the honest truth. These 3 English particles, for instance, ahead, forward, and forth, have distinctions in their meanings amongst them, but they are undifferentiated in the Korean language. Only a single Korean adverb indicating the meaning in front of something can be used in place of these 3 different English particles. The very existence of these 3 different particles itself does not exist in Korean, let alone the concept of distinctions from these 3 particles and their intended meanings. The English phrasal verbs like set forward, put forward, and move forward are all expressed into a form of one single verb in the Korean language. Unaware of the distinctions amongst ahead, forward, and forth, I avoided phrasal verb expressions such as pull ahead, forge ahead, get ahead, come forward, step forward, help forward, set forth, call forth, push ahead with, press ahead with, plan ahead for, and look ahead to. Although I have no problem understanding these expressions in the context, I would instinctively try to look for single verbs when I need to verbally say the expression in English, which does not usually work. I came face to face with the painful truth. I awakened to this sobering reality and had to confront the debilitating effects of unresolved sources of obscurity. The notion that students can learn naturally without acquiring a language's unique forms is completely unrealistic. Let me briefly explain why, even after 2 decades of having lived in the US, it's not so simple for me to catch English phrases or idioms and easily incorporate them into the part of my everyday expressions. Upon hearing a new expression, for instance, pull the rug out from under someone, my mind goes into overdrive, trying to figure out the meaning of new expressions in the context of a conversation or a TV show during a very brief moment that sometimes arrives at a proper response. Remembering each word of the expression accurately itself seems out of the question because number one, it is too long. Number two, my attention is only aimed at figuring out the meaning in the context. There is another significant reason why it's not so simple to mentally store such expressions. I assumed the expressions like reach for the stars, set in stone, within an inch of his life, and not by any stretch of the imagination, were just off the cuff creative expressions that a speaker or writer came up with on a whim. If they had only existed in a fleeting moment, I rationalized that only being able to understand their meanings was good enough. Apart from the historic and sociocultural origins of the meaning of idiomatic expressions, long English expressions, especially ones with a combination of prepositions and adverbs, now conspicuously stand out both in a written or verbal text. The more I hear my own recordings of the idiomatic expressions and phrasal verbs, the easier I found them to remember. When memorization of idiomatically fixed expressions is often found as the only option, the ability to identify the specific word arrangements of the English language is crucial to confront the grammatical and semantic obscurities. Frankly speaking, I can hardly imagine how I didn't use all these expressions all along for the last 20-something years. My disregard for the direct relation between the form and its meanings within the English language combined with the grammatical and semantic obscurity prevented me from progressing in my learning. I have a long way to go in order to achieve my dreams as a learner. However, I'm able to set clear short-term goals instead of feeling weighed down by the unrelenting helplessness like I used to. For the first time, I feel like I have gained a sense of control, since I take the greatest comfort from being able to pinpoint the root cause of my weaknesses. One of the key takeaways from delving myself into the 2 dictionaries is I lacked an understanding of the basic rules of the English language and the meanings of the English prepositions and adverbs. I had been lost in the obscurities for too long, unaware of the non-existent concepts and the basic English rules in the first place. as I was able to especially recognize the specific patterns of the basic English rules in word arrangements. It became clear that the meaning of English idiomatic phrases or phrasal verbs, when defined in the Korean language, were conveyed more vividly. I finally realized that the best way to understand the peculiar forms that define the English language is to relate to the existing cognitive structure, my native language. My solid grasp of the word's definitions in Korean accentuated the clear discrepancies in the specific formations of the expressions between the structures of two fundamentally different languages. I stopped entirely relying on English definitions. I began to look up the Korean definitions of all English words, phrasal verbs, and idiomatic phrases first, and then the English definitions. I finally let go of my stubborn insistence to use only English dictionaries for the last 2 decades. What shouldn't have come as revelation profoundly enlightened me. I wasn't exactly practicing what I was preaching. I got a dose of my own medicine. My own experiences were validated again that a learner's native language is the remedy for recognizing the clear discrepancies between the two languages in the forms and their meanings. It is fundamental to acknowledge the importance of a learner's native language in connection with the structures that define the English language. The basic English rules provide a bedrock of creativity. The basic English rules can fully be acquired only when learners are able to relate them to their existing cognitive structure, their own native language system, to reach the meaningful level of language. I myself also had been internalizing prejudice against my own native language. I was indeed very much collaborating with the widespread and long-standing misconceptions that perpetuate the fundamental unawareness among English language learners and educators. My experiences reveal that the common misconceptions deeply shared among native and non-native speaking educators and their learners are the major impediment to educational progress that undermine the effort of moving ahead. In the last 24 years, I have been surrounded by native speakers, listening and speaking English daily. I expected English phrases and idiomatic expressions to naturally come out of my mouth just because I had lived in the US for a long time. There's no such thing as learning a language naturally. There's no greater obstacle than the deeply rooted misconceptions about the language learning process that perpetuate the collective unawareness and secrecy among educators and learners. I feel compelled to share my story.